I never believed her when she said, "As long as we're together, I'm happy." She seemed more interested in convincing herself than convincing me. She suddenly informed me that she wanted to go on a girls' trip. It wasn't unusual for her to travel with her buddies. She had done it several times previously, and I had always supported her. She had long expressed a desire to visit to America with her friends while we were living in Brighton. We had built trust over the years, so I didn't give it much attention. I ensured she had everything she needed, helped her pack, and took her to the airport. I remember her final remarks before she left. She looked at me and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." I found it unusual that she would say that when I hadn't done anything particularly spectacular. But she appeared so earnest that I discounted it as a simple expression of gratitude. That night, I stayed up to ensure everything ran perfectly. I called her when she came, kept myself busy about the house, watched TV, kept track of the time, and waited for her to text me to let me know she had arrived. Her flight was supposed to take about 9 hours, so I wasn't too concerned at first. When I realized her flight had landed, I contacted her to check in. The phone continued ringing but no one answered. I didn't give it much attention. I figured she was fatigued and had gone straight to her hotel to rest. However, as AM dawned and I still hadn't heard from her, a gnawing worry crept in. I assumed she was merely busy or her phone was on quiet, so I tried calling again and texted her a few times. After a few more hours of radio silence, I was completely freaked. Finally, I called her sister to see if she'd heard from her. Nothing. I was starting to panic. In the hopes that something had gone wrong with her phone or that she just hadn't had time to check in, I even called her purported travel companions. However, they were equally bewildered as I was. When I contacted, they said they hadn't joined her on the vacation. They were actually sitting in a cafe just 2 streets away from our house, drinking their morning coffee. That's when it really hit me. She was not traveling with any other girls. She had no friends with her. She hadn't traveled with anyone. She had simply disappeared. My stomach felt like it had fallen through the floor as I sat there holding the phone. I couldn't understand it. Why would she tell me that lie? Why didn't she tell me before leaving? I tried to tell myself that it was a mistake, perhaps she had missed a connecting flight or was delayed due to an emergency. But, deep inside, I knew the truth. She had planned it. Her stating, "Thank you for being so supportive," and the entire story of a girl's trip were all part of whatever plan she had in mind. I was at a loss for what to do. It seemed like I was locked in a nightmare, unable to awaken. I'd never married a woman like her. I didn't even recognize the person. The coldness, the fact that she had stopped discussing our future, and the subtle jabs at my appearance and health, all of this immediately made sense. I just hadn't noticed. Perhaps I didn't want to see that she'd been drifting away for a time. I just sat there that night, staring at my phone, waiting for a call, a text, anything. However, nothing happened, and I knew it wouldn't. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling, and when I awoke the next morning, I assumed it was all a bad dream. However, when I noticed that her side of the bed was vacant, reality hit in. She had actually left. After packed her bag, she vanished. The promises I had made to myself the previous evening, maybe she was late, maybe her phone died, were no longer legitimate. She had plainly planned it. She wanted to leave. I was in utter denial for the first few days. I kept contacting her phone, wanting to hear her voice and get an explanation. I even left messages, hoping she'd respond. I struggled to find words half of the time, but I kept trying. However, all I got in return was quiet. Strangely, the silence made matters worse. It was as if I'd always been a stranger to her, left alone to figure out what had gone wrong. Her family was originally as astonished as I was. They had not heard from her, and her mother had no idea of her plans. In the end, I visited her family more times than I could count, desperate to meet with her mother and gain some answers. They must have felt bad for me. When I couldn't bring myself to cook, her mother would make dinners for me. She occasionally allowed me to stay at their home. She'd sit with me as I talked about all the little things that didn't make sense, trying to figure out why my life had suddenly become so complicated. To be honest, there were times when I felt too numb to talk. I would simply sit there in solitude. I alternated between wrath, sorrow and guilt. What went wrong? I kept asking myself. Was there a sign that I missed? Wasn't I paying enough attention to her? On certain days, I would go over all of our disputes and chats, attempting to figure out what had caused her to leave. I kept thinking about what I should have done better to save our marriage. It may sound dramatic, but I was possessed by the desire to find it out. I clung to the hope that obtaining the answer would somehow improve everything. I barely slept. I barely ate. My productivity began to decrease. People began to notice. When people inquired about my well-being, I would dismiss it as I was preoccupied with personal concerns. Admitting the truth, that my wife had abandoned me without saying anything, was too embarrassing. I eventually confided in a few close pals. They did their utmost to divert me by taking me out and pushing me to move on. But even when I was among them, my thoughts kept going to her. Where was she? Why wasn't I enough for her to stay? One of the most difficult parts was the constant inquiry from others, neighbors, relatives, acquaintances, and even former coworkers who had learned I was married. Each time someone inquired, "How's married life treating you?" Or, "How's your wife?" It was like peeling off a new scab. I'd simply grin and fib, assuring them everything was all right. But each time I said that lie, it felt heavier. Finally, treatment proved to be the only thing that helped. I'd never gone before, but after months of barely functioning, I realized I couldn't do it alone. I needed to speak with someone who was neutral and did not carry the weight of our common experience. I contacted a therapist and began attending weekly sessions. It helped. I talked constantly about her fury, betrayal, and the hole she had left behind. I talked about the sleepless nights, about lying awake and replaying every scene over and over. The therapist let me realize something I had not been able to accept. If she really wanted to stay, she would have. It was not my fault. She decided to depart. That was a difficult pill to swallow. For a long time, I believed myself that I was flawed and had somehow turned her away. However, I eventually came to see things differently. I chose to ignore her long-standing coldness and isolation, believing that things would improve on their own. I had convinced myself that if I just kept my cool and put in enough effort, I could save our marriage by myself. The revelation that I couldn't, that nothing was ever enough, hurt. As time passed, I started rebuilding my life piece by piece. It wasn't until she left that I realized how much I'd lost in our marriage. I had always tried my hardest to make her happy and to keep our home life comfortable. But now, with so much free time, I'm at a loss for what to do. So I began revisiting old pastimes that I had long forgotten. I tried making fresh meals. I went to the gymnasium. I started reading novels that I'd been putting off for years. Finally, my work improved. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping up. However, when I began to feel more like myself, I increased my effort at work. It was one of the few things I still felt in control of, and it gave me a sense of success. I'd always been brilliant at what I did, but now I threw myself entirely into it. The extra hours, the focus, they paid off. I got a promotion. Something I would not have accomplished if I had spent all of my time drowning in my sadness. Nevertheless, there were difficult days. A picture, an old movie ticket stub, or another minor memory would abruptly transport me back to the past. I'd find myself wondering if she ever thought about me or regretted what she'd done. But as time passed, those instances got fewer and farther apart. Each time, it grew little easier to let go. I also reconnected with people I had lost touch with after getting married. We went trekking. We went to the golf range. I began doing activities that I hadn't done in years. Having friends by my side, people who weren't caught up in the turmoil and could support me without dragging me back into the pain, was a huge comfort. Looking back, I realized I had invested too much of myself in that connection. As her husband, I had lost a huge part of me. When she departed, it felt as if she had stolen a piece of me with her. However, I was gradually rediscovering myself. It was not quick, it was not easy. But I was making progress. At the end of that year, when I looked in the mirror, I saw more than simply a man whose wife had abandoned him. I'd rebuilt. I had survived. I was stronger now. For the first time in years, I felt free to live my life without her shadow lurking over me. And I took pride in it. I genuinely thought I'd moved on from everything. After all of the commotion, things had begun to feel normal again, or as normal as it could be. Work was progressing smoothly. My friends kept me busy. I had a routine down. Even my thoughts of her had disappeared. Sure, there were occasional flashbacks, odd recollections that appeared unexpectedly, but they weren't as often as previously, when everything I did seemed to be linked to her. She was the last person I expected to see standing outside my door on Saturday morning. But there she was. She holds a baby in her arms. I got chilled. It was like witnessing a ghost. For a little while, my brain ceased to operate. She appeared nearly identical, perhaps a touch worn down, but otherwise unchanged. And the way she looked at me, as if she truly believed I would be delighted to see her, moved me. I thought I had stopped caring. But meeting her again resurfaced emotions I had long suppressed. For a minute, I stood there in silence, staring. She smiled as if nothing had happened and asked, "May I come in?" A nerve.